perceive or receive the Manusmriti. So I have picked out a few examples which throw a light on the Savarna reception of the Manusmriti in contemporary India. So just a second. Yeah, so I would like to begin with this photograph that I clicked in the year 2015, almost 6 years back, when I was a student at Ferguson College. It is a plush house at Apte Road, again, as I said, very near to Ferguson College, which is named Manusmriti, and this was very early in my college when I encountered this, and this was sort of my first brush with the presence of the Manusmriti in what can be called the social psyche of caste Hindus in India. I saw this house and then I wondered what must have um, made the person who owned this house name it as Manusmriti, whether the person had read the text or not, and whether they read the text, what must have appealed them from within the text such that they wanted to name their house after it. So this sort of marking of one's house in the public sphere by the name of a text which is at least 2000 years old was quite interesting, and I have been thinking about this the cultural symbolism around the Manusmriti since that time. Sorry. Yeah, more recently, one could observe our national broadcaster, one of our national broadcasters, Lok Sabha TV, putting out this show on its television channel called Katha Ek Pustak Ki Vishuddh Manusmriti, which was written by Surendra Kumar. Vishuddh Manusmriti translates into pure Manusmriti. And it is a defense of the Manusmriti against many of the criticisms that are leveled against it. And again, it was very curious as to why the state broadcaster, or rather the broadcaster of the Indian Parliament, should make a show about a text which was ceremoniously burnt by none other than the architect of the Constitution. So again, this was something that I found interesting and I thought of sharing with you. Another instance that I noted was this tweet that the Congress unit of Karnataka had put up on Twitter, of course, utilizing the vocabulary of the pandemic, where they named Manusmriti as the virus and put the Constitution of India as its vaccine. And the date is also important here. It was posted on the 14th of April this year. I mean, that is Baba Saheb's birth anniversary. And the Congress, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, actually deleted this tweet later. And the BJP had this to say that why does Congress hate Hindus so much? Will Congress show the guts to name the book that is the real virus? And of course, why did Congress delete this tweet? So again, it was very interesting that the BJP, which of course rules the central government right now, explicitly said on Baba Saheb's birth anniversary that the Manusmriti is in fact sacred, or at least of religious and cultural significance for all Hindus, and any word against it will be taken as anti-Hindu content, which can be punished the way they want. So again, this was something that was interesting of note in contemporary India. And this also shows the sort of the antagonistic or conflicting pair between the Manusmriti and the Constitution that exists in the caste Hindu psyche. This is the final example that I wanted to share with you, where in the year 2018, a member of a right-wing political organization called Arakshan Virodhi Party, or opposition to a reservation party, burnt a copy of the Constitution at the Jantar Mantar, where many protests happen in New Delhi. So the police arrested this person, and afterwards they asked him to explain why did he burn this a copy of the Constitution, which is a criminal offense. And he said that he wanted to protest against the amendments brought by the parliament to the SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act. And again, this was something very interesting because one, he was mimicking, he was doing an act of mimicry of the way the Manusmriti is burnt, ceremoniously every year, 25 on 25th December after 1927. And secondly, it was also interesting because he used a copy of the Constitution to show his disregard or to show his discontent against scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, as if to put the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and the Constitution into one bracket, with which he is not concerned, even as an Indian citizen. So again, this was something interesting as to why is this duality or this pairing of the Constitution always comes with the Manusmriti in a certain mentality in contemporary India. And I see the origin of this mentality in the term coined during 1950s, titled the modern Manu for Ambedkar, and how Ambedkar's efforts during the Constituent Assembly debates and as the chairperson of the drafting committee of the Constitution earned him the moniker or the name of the modern Manu, which is of course ironic because he had himself burnt a copy of the Manusmriti earlier. As you can see in this cartoon published in 1950, the two security guards of the parliament are discussing who is this person. And one security guard says he is Ambedkar, our new Brahmin. And Ambedkar here is shown as someone who is wearing the sacred thread or the Janeu with the Constitution under his arms, and his followers, who are again portrayed in a stereotypical way, standing behind him. So again, this is something that shows something about the psyche of the caste Hindus, where the cultural stereotype of Hinduism is always brought into the picture when the Constitution is discussed. And this is something that I wish to explore further in this presentation by tracing the origin of the term modern Manu within the Constituent Assembly. So I will be mostly discussing the Hindu Code Bill debates, which were very controversial during the early years of India's independence, and really delve into the record of the debates to show what kinds of uses this term was, what kind of uses this term was deployed for, and how did Ambedkar himself respond to whether this term was appropriate or not. So I'm going to mostly read from my written presentation, but I hope it will not be very boring. So yeah, the debates regarding the Hindu Code Bill in the Constituent Assembly mark a strangely recurring appearance of the names of the Smritikar or lawgiver Manu and the name of the law book, the Manusmriti. This draft bill, the Hindu Code Bill, introduced by Ambedkar on the 11th of April 1947 in the Constituent Assembly, which also simultaneously functioned as the parliament of the soon-to-be independent country, sought to codify procedures relating to marriage, maintenance, succession, inheritance, divorce, guardianship, and adoption pertaining to Hindu law into a single legislation. This legislation generated massive opposition from conservative organizations and individuals, both inside and outside the assembly, resulting in Ambedkar's resignation from his post of the Minister of Law in 1951 on account of the Congress party's handling of the legislation. We know that the legislation was not passed in the way Dr. Ambedkar had intended. So even before N.V. Gadgil, a member of the Constituent Assembly and a fervent supporter of Ambedkar's efforts at social reform, coined the term modern Manu for Ambedkar, the stage for the recurring appearances of Manu in the Hindu Code Bill debates was already set. So at the first conference of the Untouchables in 1935 at Yeola in Nashik district of Maharashtra, where Ambedkar had first proclaimed his decision of renouncing Hinduism, where he had said, I was born a Hindu, but I will not die one. One resolution was passed whose title read, quote, to the untouchable community, a new message of a new Manu, end of quote. This is from a text by Patrick Olivelle, which is the translated edition of the Manusmriti. This was from the introduction. And this resolution was also published in Ambedkar's newspaper Janata afterwards. So this is the first and perhaps the only instance where Ambedkar consciously avows a positive relationship with the figure and name of Manu, Hinduism's most authoritative lawgiver. Ambedkar's avowal or acceptance of being the new Manu in 1935 is as fascinating as it is strange, uh, because it represented his self-declared affinity with the ancient lawgiver in a way that was to anticipate similar titles attributed to him during the course of the Hindu Code Bill debates. So Gadgil, who unconditionally supported Ambedkar's draft of the Hindu Code Bill, came up with the coinage of the modern Manu in the context of providing the bill with the justification of having a continuity with Hindu tradition. Marking a continuity between the figures of Manu and Ambedkar in not only authoring the most authoritative code of laws in the ancient and the modern periods, respectively, but also in effecting the most wide-ranging impact upon social structure, such that their place in history could only be measured in terms of epoch-making greatness. Gadgil elaborated upon the following justification for supporting the bill. This is what he said. The point is, all those laws or customs which definitely have affected the progressive character of Hindu society ought to go. Dr. S.P. Mukherjee made a reference to Brahmo Samaj and Sadhana Samaj. From Raja Ram Mohan Roy to Rana De, Tilak, Agarkar, there is a galaxy of social reformers of whom we are all proud. But why should the process stop there? If what was done in the past was good, we ought to follow the same principles of progress. And if we follow that same line of advancement, why should you be afraid now? Why should you think that because Manu was great, therefore there cannot be any man as great as Manu in the centuries that may roll after his death? Dr. Ambedkar is as great as Manu or Gargya. A member immediately responds to Gadgil, named only as an honorable member in the record of the debates, with the words, Ambedkar is Manu, insisting on the comparison even more emphatically. So it's very interesting that this term modern Manu was actually coined by a supporter of the bill and not an opponent of the bill. So Gadgil here makes Ambedkar equal to Manu in the Ambedkar is the most recent but equally great manifestation in the long series of social reformers and lawgivers that Hindu society has witnessed. Although the term modern Manu does not appear in this particular paragraph, the attribution of this term is acknowledged by a member, Jhunjhunwala, to be Gadgil's. Through this coinage, Gadgil sought to make Manu as the parameter with which Ambedkar's effort of introducing a new law could be measured. In an effort to salvage his support for the bill, as well as to underline the necessity of social reform, Gadgil's coinage of the term modern Manu represents his effort to assimilate Ambedkar within the canon of great lawgivers and social reformers as encountered in Hindu/Indian history. So Gadgil attempted to shield the Hindu Code Bill from possible criticism by drawing an equivalence between Manu and Ambedkar. However, other members of the assembly modified this name to the disadvantage of Ambedkar himself. So I'm going to discuss a few examples here. One set of members underlined the unworthiness of Ambedkar for the title modern Manu, thus indicating his unworthiness of becoming a lawgiver itself. So Babu Ram Narayan Singh said, quote, those of us who make a mention of Manu Maharaj, some amongst them say likewise that Dr. Ambedkar is Manu of the day. And Dr. Ambedkar interjects, I have not accepted that title. Babu Ram Narayan Singh bluntly retorts, saying, do not accept it, please. They say it wrongly, as you, in fact, do not deserve it. This is not a thing to be accepted. Those who confer this title upon you do it by way of flattery. If you are called Manu, all of us too would like to be called so. Why you alone? So, Singh's disdain over Gadgil's attribution of the epithet of modern Manu for Ambedkar took other forms as well. The audacity of Gadgil's coinage was sought to be overturned by newer coinages still, and the assimilation of Ambedkar within the grain of Hindu tradition that Gadgil had sought to achieve with this epithet was also turned into its opposite, with counter claims of decay and degradation within the tradition itself. So, for instance, Shri Jhunjhunwala refers to Ambedkar as, quote, the Manu of Kali Yuga, to which Shri Shyamnandan Sahai retorts back saying, not the Manu of Kali Yuga, but Kali Yugi Manu, insisting the decadent quality of the lawgiver as being appropriate to the decadent quality or the deteriorating quality of the age of Kali Yuga itself. Another example of a new coinage is that of Mr. H.P. Kamath, who referred to the Hindu Code Bill as the 138th or the newest Smriti in Hinduism, terming it the Bhim Smriti, referring to Ambedkar's first name. Mr. Naziruddin Ahmad, who was an opponent of the bill, went even further and underlined the significance of the bill in highly superlative terms, pointing out that it was Ambedkar's attempt to place himself not only within the pantheon of Smritikaras like Manu, Gautama, Bodhanaya, etc., but among the composers of the Vedas themselves, with the crucial caveat that Ambedkar's Veda was supposed to supersede all previous Vedas. So here are Naziruddin Ahmad's words. Mr. Kamath compared the present bill to a new Smriti, Dr. Ambedkar's 138th Smriti. I think this is not a Smriti at all. The Smriti proceeds from the Shrutis. There is a pretense to agree with the principles of these Shrutis. This is a bill which is not a Smriti but a new Veda, to which Pandit Lakshmikant Maitra interjects. It is Vismriti, that is a corrupted form of the Smriti. He continues, it is Vismriti, that is forgetfulness of the past. All sacred laws and customs, rules, laws, decisions, principles of the Privy Council are brushed aside by one stroke of the pen by Dr. Ambedkar in defiance of the report of the Rao Committee. Everything is gone. It is Vismriti, as Pandit Maitra with good humor suggests. It is Vismriti, absolute forgetfulness. It is a new Veda. There are 4 Vedas, the Sama Veda, Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, and Atharva Veda. I think the new Veda should be called Dr. Amba Veda, and this is the 5th Veda in utter defiance and disregard of all the 4 Vedas which it supersedes. End of quote. Finally, the last instance that I wish to discuss, where the term modern Manu was used to the disadvantage of Ambedkar, was during an exchange between him and Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya in the Constituent Assembly. So Pandit Malviya says, the Honorable Law Minister has been likened, even profanely is the crucial word here, to no less a sage than Manu himself. And I am reminded of a shloka, interruption. Somebody asks me why I am jealous. Unfortunately or fortunately, I am not so built that I should have the privilege of being jealous towards the Honorable Law Minister. To which Dr. Ambedkar replies, how can a Brahmin be jealous of an untouchable? So this question that Dr. Ambedkar puts forth in the Constituent Assembly to Pandit Malviya is really important because it, thoroughly exposes the subtle and not so subtle casteism that was at play, because it was Ambedkar who introduced the Hindu Code Bill, and it was Ambedkar who introduced the question of social reform within Hindu society at the time. And the question of whether Ambedkar could properly, as an untouchable, be allowed to legislate something relating to the Hindu society was questioned by most upper caste members of the Constituent Assembly at the time. So the substance of Malviya's jealousy in this instance arises because of the profane, the word that he used, that is anti-religious character of Ambedkar's lawmaking authority, because he was born as an untouchable and was seeking, as he said, to tamper with the foundations of Hindu society. Arguably, Malviya would have been less jealous and considered it properly religious as opposed to profane had it been a Brahmin, or perhaps he himself, spearheading his lawmaking authority in making important changes to the social foundations of the Hindus, even if in the secular domain of the Indian Parliament. So the name of modern Manu coined by Gadgil for Ambedkar thus invited other kinds of claims which either questioned Ambedkar's assimilation within the tradition of Hindu law or made this assimilation into an object of ridicule, insult, and humiliation. Gadgil and Kamath used the epithet for underlining Ambedkar's greatness as being equal to that of Manu, thus underlining his equal capacity to legislate upon matters relating to the Hindu society. This remained the minority view in the assembly, however, as a number of other members outlined their opposition to the bill by making different uses of the same epithet, ranging from Singh's remark of Ambedkar's unworthiness for this new name to Jhunjhunwala's and Sahai's disparaging description of Ambedkar as the lawgiver suited for the age of the Kali Yuga, to Ahmad's underlining of Ambedkar's hubris in seeking to supersede not only the Smritis but also the Vedas, and finally to Malviya's charge that there is a certain profanity in the manner in which Dr. Ambedkar's name is compared to that of Manu. So keeping in view the range of these uses made of the name modern Manu during the course of the Hindu Code Bill debates, it is important to ask the following question. Namely, where did Ambedkar himself stand on the question of whether this name was appropriate or not? So the following example is instructive to determine Ambedkar's own position about whether this name is appropriate or not. Sardar B.S. Man, another member of the assembly, was pleading before the speaker that an exception needs to be made for the Punjab region, as it has not been historically governed by the procedures of Hindu law. He made the following usage of this name while outlining his opposition to the Hindu Code Bill. He says, if I have enjoyed emancipation from Manu for so long a time, will it not be a tyranny of the times if I have to submit now to a modern Manu? If I have not been governed by Brahmanical rule and I have had secular law for a long time in Punjab, if I have not accepted Manu's religion, then let me assure the House that Punjab is not going to accept Ambedkarian religion henceforward. Let me give credit to Manu that at least he was original in many respects. But my modern Manu, oh, what a fall has he had. He is neither original nor progressive. You ask, who is the modern Manu? Well, I need not say. To which Dr. Ambedkar unprompted says that I am not a modern Manu. So ever since Gadgil came up with this coinage, its propriety was always at issue with such members who were the opponents of the bill. If we recall Ambedkar's own affinity to this name, where in 1935, he had passed the resolution with the title to the untouchable community, a new message of a new Manu, the issue of whether Ambedkar, born as he was among the untouchables of the Hindu social order, possessed the capacity for drafting the law with which Hindu society was to function, was hotly contested. Ambedkar's position as the chair of the drafting committee of the Constitution, along with his piloting of a bill seeking a reform in the gender relations within Hindu society, had raised this contentious question once again of whether it was proper or religious for the Hindu society to follow the laws laid down by an untouchable, and whether it was proper or religious for an untouchable to claim the capacity of laying down the law for Hindu society. Hence, even as Ambedkar avowed for himself the title of a new Manu in 1935, and even as he later rejected the title of the modern Manu for himself during the Hindu Code Bill debates, the conflict between his birth as an untouchable within the Hindu social order and his acquired capacity to legislate, we should remember that Dr. Ambedkar was a barrister, became crucial questions which were put forward for contestation both inside and outside the space of the Constituent Assembly. Here, the meaning of the name Manu itself acquires at least two highly different characteristics. One referring to Manu as the most authoritative lawgiver of Hindu society, and second to the Manu whose laws were a source of oppression for the Shudras, Atishudras, and women. Thus, between Ambedkar's affinity with this name and his later rejection of it, one finds the charge of both these characteristics. On the one hand, Ambedkar claims for himself by the title New Manu the fundamental capacity to legislate, something that was ritually forbidden for the untouchables by the Manusmriti itself. On the other hand, through disavowing the epithet of the modern Manu, Ambedkar denounces the legitimacy of Manu's laws, which sanction hierarchy and graded inequality as what he called the basic conceptions which underlie the Hindu social organization. End of quote. So this was the first big part of my presentation. The second part of my presentation deals with defining Ambedkar's constitutionalism and how it related to the Manusmriti. So I argue that the Manusmriti assumes a critical reference point within Ambedkar's constitutional and legislative efforts on mainly two counts. I argue that the modern constitution was intended by Ambedkar as the historical, legal, and most importantly, the political antithesis of the Manusmriti. The first commonality for Dr. Ambedkar between the Manusmriti and the Constitution was simply that they were both books of law. Manusmriti enters as a problematic for Ambedkar's constitutionalism when we underline that it represented for him the document that granted a divine and legal sanction to the injustices routinely perpetrated against the lower castes within the Hindu society. So the first aspect in which the Manusmriti enters as a problematic for Ambedkar's constitutionalism is the response to this question, how to negate the public legitimacy owed to instances of violence against the depressed classes. So he found in the constitution a tool to legally and politically negate the effectively lawful character of the violence practiced against the untouchables. Or to say it differently, Ambedkar's constitutionalism sought to negate the public legitimacy owed to instances of violence against the most vulnerable social groups in Indian society. The second and related aspect in which the Manusmriti enters as a problematic in Ambedkar's constitutionalism is the way in which he sought to achieve a revolution in India without the use of violence. This is also something I argue is his difference from the Marxists on the question of the revolution. So Ambedkar once described the Manusmriti as, quote, the constitution of the counter-revolution, which is very interesting because he uses the term constitution for the Manusmriti in this instance. And the most glaring character of the revolution in ancient India, which resulted in the composition of the Manusmriti, was its concomitant violence, where, as Dr. Ambedkar argues, and as has been corroborated by scholars like Patrick Olivelle and Wendy Doniger, the Brahmin military commander Pushyamitra Sunga had murdered the Shudra king Brihadrat Maurya, and it is only in the after effects of this regicide or the murder of the king that the Manusmriti was composed. So according to Ambedkar, the historical composition of the Manusmriti cannot be separated from this regime change. And according to Ambedkar, this regime change was brought about through sheer violence. So the composition of the Manusmriti in this instance thus raised a genuinely difficult question for Ambedkar's theory of politics itself, which includes his constitutional and legislative efforts, namely how to create or achieve a revolution in India without the use of violence. I think this is the crucial question that Ambedkar's political philosophy tries to answer through his constitutionalism. Or to put it differently, could there be a non-violent revolution? If yes, then what is the responsibility of the constitution or the law in achieving a revolution that is truly non-violent? So the new founding law of the constitution can be interpreted to seek to negate and replace the old founding law, or the basis of the old foundations, which for Ambedkar were constituted by the laws of Manu. What is important to note here is that for Ambedkar, not only does the Manusmriti persist as the textual symbol of the violence of Hindu law towards the most unequal classes, but also the fact that since it effectively carried what he called the force of law amongst the Hindu public, there is a need to duly counter it by means of another legal order, which would criminalize practicing violence and oppression against such classes. So in such a situation, violence against untouchables and other oppressed social groups would have to be carried out in open defiance of the Constitution of India. I think this is the precise value because of which the oppressed masses in India still stick to the Constitution, because it still provides for a certain space whereby any act of violence that is done against them or any act of exclusion that is done against them would have to be carried out in open defiance of the principles of the Constitution of India. Continuing with this theme of revolution, I argue that through the Constitution, Ambedkar had intended to explore the possibility of a revolution that will totally avoid the use of violence. In other words, the Constitution represented an effort in Ambedkar's thinking and political action, which would stand for a revolution that is non-violent in its consequences. This is what I argue is the precise place of Ambedkar's constitutionalism within his political philosophy, achieving a revolution that is non-violent in its consequences. Here, Ambedkar's understanding of democracy plays a highly important role. So in a speech titled Conditions Precedent for the Successful Working of Democracy, delivered at Pune itself in 1952, he says, "My definition of democracy is a form and a method of government whereby revolutionary changes in the economic and social life of the people are brought about without bloodshed." A very significant quote, in my opinion. So I argue here that the Constitution or the law represented one medium for Ambedkar, whereby such a revolutionary aim of democracy could be achieved without the use of violence. The debates during the Hindu Code Bill were indicative of how seriously Ambedkar considered democracy as the only legitimate means of bringing about any measure of social change, including revolutionary change. So this is the final part of my presentation. where I argue that it is important to emphasize the tremendous sense of self-critical awareness with which Ambedkar holds forth both the potentialities and the limitations of constitutionalism. We mostly saw the potentialities, but I argue that Ambedkar gives an equal amount of attention to the limitations of constitutionalism. Even though it may be claimed that he saw in the Constitution of modern India an immense possibility whereby a legal order could be instituted, which not only criminalizes caste exclusion and untouchability, but also proclaims the ideals of justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity in all spheres of collective life, he nonetheless refrained from overestimating its political efficacy and refrained from turning it into a fetish. For to have done that would have been to endow the Constitution with the sense of a fetishistic divinity, which reduces its reading and interpretation into mere idolatry and its readers and interpreters into a mere cult of worshippers. The substance of constitutionalism remained normatively desirable for Ambedkar only so long as it is on the way of fulfilling its revolutionary potential, which would imply countering the counter-revolutionary consequences of Brahminism in modern India. Ambedkar very searingly says in one of the chapter titles in his unpublished and incomplete text, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Ancient India, the chapter heading is "The current age is the age of the counter-revolution." So Ambedkar was very well aware that what we are living through is a sort of a counter-revolution. And the name for this counter-revolution is Brahminism, according to him. And which is not dying or is not dead in modern India, according to Ambedkar. In a statement during a parliamentary debate in 1953, which sounds a reminiscence of his own act of burning the Manusmriti in 1927, Dr. Ambedkar speaks the following. He says, "Sir, my friends tell me that I have made the constitution, but I am quite prepared to say that I shall be the first person to burn it out. I do not want it. It does not suit anybody. But whatever that may be, if our people want to carry on, they must not forget that there are majorities and there are minorities. And they simply cannot ignore the minorities by saying, oh no, to recognize you is to harm democracy. I should say that the greatest harm will come by injuring the minorities." End of quote. So Ambedkar's very sober realization that the constitution and the law remain highly prone to being politically misappropriated in the hands of the majority for the purposes of dominating the minorities sounds a highly complex quality within the range of his constitutionalism. For Ambedkar was careful to recognize that the constitution could as easily become the tool of the counter-revolution, as was the case with the Manusmriti, which would in effect use the law to sanction and perpetuate an unequal and unjust social order. That the constitution of modern India remained on the side of the revolution was both Ambedkar's highest hope as well as the subject of his most profound disappointment with it. And I guess as we see the political events unfolding before our eyes in the contemporary time, the only Ambedkarite response towards the constitution could be this mixture of high hope as well as a sense of profound disappointment. I will stop here. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Ankit. It was really thought-provoking and eye-opener, in fact, concise presentation. I forgot to mention two things about you while introducing. Ankit's name was mentioned in the Bluestone Rising Scholar Competition conducted by CAST, a global journal on exclusion, and Brandeis University. Again, he got first prize in the MP Nigam Memorial Essay Writing Competition on the topic, and the topic was "If You Are Today's Ambedkar." It was conducted by the Ambedkar Library, Safai Karmachari Andolan in New Delhi. So I forgot that. Now the session is open for question and answer. आपले काही प्रश्न असतील, काही सूचना असतील, काही फीडबॅक असेल, आपण विचारू शकता. There are only, there is appreciation from Khatu ma'am and Manik Sonam. That's it.
Thank you so much, Khatu ma'am. If people, I mean, I'm sure people don't know, but Khatu ma'am was my political science teacher throughout the 3 years of Ferguson College. So really happy to see you here, ma'am.
Really happy to hear you, Ankit. Very, very well prepared as always, articulate and thorough with your work. Excellent. Feels nice.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yeah. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Sir, even though after all of these efforts taken by Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, we still see a sentiment of, say, in the community, we still see that there is still a sentiment where the untouchables or the Dalits are not inclusive enough. We see we get jobs in sectors and all of those things, but in family life and family issues which are out of these realms, still they are not inclusive. Could you comment on this, please?
Okay, I will go one by one. Thank you, Aditya, for this question. I mean, yeah, you have raised a pertinent question. I think this is something that the people of the community itself have to sort of self-introspect as to what what aspects of their public life or private life is not inclusive or not egalitarian. I would mention two instances where I mean, from perhaps Dr. Ambedkar's own life, where he thought that there is a necessity of having changes or reform within the community on at least 2-3 aspects. One was, of course, the question of the subcastes, where there was a caste hierarchy, or there was a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority within the broadly considered lower castes. So the Shudras would look down upon the untouchables, and within the untouchables, certain castes will look down upon certain castes, and so on. And endogamy, that is the practice of not marrying outside your own social group, was also very much prevalent within these communities. Secondly, the question was, of course, the question of gender and patriarchy, and Ambedkar had no illusions. I don't know if I should say this, but some people have this illusion during our time that there is no patriarchy amongst Dalits or something like that. Dr. Ambedkar did not think that way, and he did think that the gender question was very important. I mean, the whole Hindu Code bill, consists of reforming the gender relations of Hindu society. So, to your question, I would simply say that the contemporary leadership or the contemporary masses of oppressed castes should also, self-introspect and see that the question of subcaste hierarchy, the question of endogamy, caste endogamy, and the question of gender are also, not going away anytime soon. So I can give you this sort of an imperfect response at this point.
That's fine, sir. Thank you.
I think there is question in chat box. Exclusiveness being a core feature of the caste system, each caste as a community is wired to exclusion rather than inclusion. As caste members, we tend to have anxiety at, okay, that's the comment. Okay, I thought there is a question.
No, it is a very important. It is a very important comment, and I also definitely agree with the comment in broad strokes. Also, because I mean, the reasons that I think Dr. Ambedkar portrays such a thing as happening within Hindu society, where exclusiveness is really, again, the core of the caste system, where he says that fraternity does not exist within Hindu society. So fraternity simply does not mean that one caste is not cohabiting with the other caste and so on and so forth, or that there exists caste endogamy within within a particular society, so there is no fraternity. Fraternity for Ambedkar also meant something like familiarizing yourself with a stranger. So the suspicion towards a stranger is also a sign of the lack of fraternity for Dr. Ambedkar. One example that sometimes is given in many sources of Dalit literature, for instance, is where the person is traveling in the city and they encounter a stranger, and the stranger is very uncomfortable with the fact of not knowing the caste of the protagonist in those autobiographical accounts or in those stories. So this is something that is really interesting, no? Why do strangers feel so uncomfortable around you when they do not know your caste? And why is anonymity, or why is not anonymity per se, but being casteless is in a way impossible, that one must know the other person's caste in order to have any kind of familiarity or a relation of hostility towards them. So yeah, I think that is very pertinent in the way Ambedkar thinks about fraternity and the lack of fraternity in our society. I can see a question here by Zamir. I should read it out. How do you interpret Ambedkar's juxtaposition of the constitution and Buddha and his Dhamma? Is it Ambedkar's belief in the limitations of constitution? Is Dhamma a theologico-political constitution? Was constitution not enough? That is a very good question. This is something that is being discussed in recent literature as well. The problem, is framed at least in two ways. The first framing is that Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism and Ambedkar writing the Buddha and his Dhamma was a turn away from the modern state towards religion, or so this is the first way to put it. And the second way to put it is that Dr. Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism showcased his dissatisfaction with constitutional reforms, or with political reforms, or with political participation in India. I think, my tentative belief, I am still learning, I am still, reading Dr. Ambedkar's works, but so far I have understood that both these articulations are slightly wrong-headed, for the following two reasons. First is that when we talk about Ambedkar's conversion as implying his move away from the modern state, we assume that there is something like a Gandhian inflection in Ambedkar's conversion. This is an interpretation of D.R. Nagaraj, that just as Gandhi learned from Ambedkar the importance of the annihilation of caste, Ambedkar learned from Gandhi the importance of religion in public life, in private life. I do not think that is a very good interpretation, because for Ambedkar, the question of religion was still concomitant with having a modern state. So even if Gandhi rejects the modern state and Gandhi has a critique of the modern state, I do not think Ambedkar, turns so much in the Gandhian line that he rejects the conception of the modern state and believes that religion as a, as an imaginary can provide the rules for coexistence in a modern society. At least at this point, this is what I think. And on the second question of whether the conversion to Buddhism and whether the Buddha and his Dhamma showed a certain limitation to constitutionalism, yes, as I argued in my presentation as well, Ambedkar did recognize that there were limitations to constitutionalism. and he recognized that what he called communal majority. The communal majority is the biggest, enemy sort of constitutionalism, and it is the communal majority which poses the biggest limitation in front of the constitution. So we should not overestimate its political efficacy. At the same time, the question of the question of conversion to Buddhism is something that goes hand in hand with recognizing what is the true source of this limitation in front of constitutionalism. So it is not the untouchables' preference for a more egalitarian religion that showcases the limitation of constitutionalism. According to Ambedkar, the inegalitarian, that is unequal religion of the majority is what poses a limit, is what presents itself as a bigger limitation to constitutionalism. So I do not at least frame the discussion in a way that Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism takes away from his constitutionalism in a way.
Whose mic is on? Yes.
Okay, there is another question which I should read.
Yes. एक मिनिट.
Okay, Shriranjan sir, you can read it.
Yes. प्रश्न असा सुवर्ण मोरेंचा, आंबेडकरी चळवळीमध्ये त्या टप्प्यावरती या सर्व डिबेटच्या घुसळणी झालेल्या आहेत. जेव्हा आज आपण विद्यापीठ स्तरावर सैद्धांतिक स्तरावर
किसी कोई पीरियड है तो भी फर्क नहीं पड़ना चाहिए पूरे अपने को ही करने का.
काय है
अच्छा चलेगा कि मुझे पूछने का.
आज आपण विद्यापीठ स्तरावरती सैद्धांतिक स्तरावर या सर्व चर्चेला पुन्हा पाहतो, तेव्हा मास व्ह्यू सोडून तात्विक चर्चेत अडकतो आहोत का? बहुसंख्याक विरुद्ध अल्पसंख्याक संघर्ष आणि त्यातील मर्यादा आंबेडकरांनी संविधान सबमिशनच्याच वेळी देखील आज संविधान चालते आहे, याकडे चिकित्सक दृष्टीने कसे पाहता येईल? मला वाटतं प्रश्न तुला लक्षात आला असेल. ओके,
प्रश्न मला लक्षात आलाय. आणखी इथे प्रश्न दोन याच्यात डिवाइड करता येईल. पहिला क्वेश्चन असा आहे की डॉक्टर आंबेडकरांच्या म्हणजे पुस्तकांवर आपण असं विद्यापीठीय स्तरावर असं आपण डिस्कशन वगैरे करतो, तेव्हा मास व्ह्यू सोडून आपण असं एक डिफ्लेक्ट होतो का? मला वाटतं असं की असं टेंडन्सी खूप आहे. एस्पेशली म्हणजे मी JNU मध्ये वगैरे काही ऐकतो तर खूप काय म्हणू शकतो आपण मेटाफिजिकल लेवलवर ते आंबेडकरांचं डिस्कशन घेऊन जातात. आणखी मला वाटते की ते जे मूळ प्रश्न आहेत, फॉर इन्स्टन्स आय ऑलवेज आस्क देम वेअर डज एनहायलेशन ऑफ कास्ट fit in your metaphysical discussion of Ambedkar, something like that, or where does the social or the political project of Dr. Ambedkar fit within your sort of metaphysical discussions. तर ते खूपच महत्वाचा प्रश्न आहे. आणखी मला वाटते की जसं जसं आंबेडकर ग्लोबलाइज झालेले आहेत, म्हणजे आता आंबेडकरांवर बाहेर देशात किंवा आपल्याही देशात जे म्हणजे पहिले काम नाही करत होते, आता जे लोक काम करत आहेत, त्यांची अशी टेंडन्सी खूप बघता येईल की ते म्हणजे आंबेडकरांना आपल्या कॉन्टेक्स्ट मधून दूर घेऊन कोणत्या तरी दुसऱ्या प्रश्नांवर त्यांना बोलवायला लावतील. आणखी those questions will not be pertinent or they will not be relevant for the social and political questions that we very visibly see in Ambedkar's political philosophy. तर अशा याच्यात आपल्याला फक्त म्हणजे मला वाटते विजिलंट राहावं लागेल की आपण जेव्हाही असं काम बघतो डॉक्टर आंबेडकरांवर होत असणार, म्हणजे माझ्याकडून झालं असणार तर मला पण म्हणजे तुम्ही टीका करू शकता इथून की डॉक्टर आंबेडकरांचं जे पॉलिटिकल फिलॉसॉफी आहे त्याच्यावरून आपण भटकून कुठे दुसऱ्या प्रश्नांवर किंवा कोणत्या दुसऱ्या अशा कॉन्टेक्स्टवर जे म्हणजे विच इज नॉट व्हेरी रेलेव्हंट फॉर आंबेडकर and for the project, the political and social project that he believed in, असं काही डिस्कशन्स होत असणार तर आपल्याला मग असं सहज राहावं लागेल, म्हणजे आपल्याला विजिलंट राहावं लागेल अशा वेळी. की दुसरा प्रश्न आहे तोही खूप इम्पॉर्टंट आहे. ते लिहिलंय बहुसंख्याक व अल्पसंख्याक संघर्ष आणि त्यातील मर्यादा. आंबेडकर यांनी संविधान सबमिट करण्याच्या वेळी करून देखील आज संविधान चालते आहे. दॅट इज ट्रू, बट संविधानचा स्ट्रक्चरच असा आहे की विच हॅज टू कीप चेंजिंग. आंबेडकर ऑफन कोटेड थॉमस जेफरसन view where Jefferson had said that each generation has a right to its own constitution, or each generation has the right to frame its own laws. तर कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन एक रिजिड नसतो, कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन फ्लेक्झिबल पण असतो. आणखी डॉक्टर आंबेडकरांचा इथे सूर काय होता की कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन आपण एकेकाळी बनवून टाकला, आणखी त्याच्यात आपण चांगले विधान लिहून टाकले की म्हणजे प्रिएम्बल मध्ये लिबर्टी, फ्रेटर्निटी, इक्वालिटी, जस्टिस असं सगळं लिहून टाकलं. तर त्याला पॉलिटिकल प्रॅक्टिस मध्ये आणायला यू नीड अ सर्टन ओरिएंटेशन ऑफ पॉलिटिकल पॉवर. आणि डॉक्टर आंबेडकरांचं खूप हे म्हणजे असं ठाम व्ह्यू होता. म्हणजे कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन अंमलमध्ये आल्यानंतर 1950च्या नंतर त्यांचे जर आपण स्पीचेस बघूया तर तिथे ते सतत कम्युनल मेजॉरिटी बद्दल बोलतात की हे कम्युनल मेजॉरिटी एक्झॅक्टली आहे काय. तर डॉक्टर आंबेडकर म्हणतात की कम्युनल मेजॉरिटी इज नॉट अ पॉलिटिकल मेजॉरिटी. अ पॉलिटिकल मेजॉरिटी हॅज टू बी मेड अँड अ पॉलिटिकल मेजॉरिटी इज डिफरंट ॲट इन each period, but a communal majority remains the same. तर आता जर आपण पॉलिटिकल पॉवरचे कॉन्फिगरेशन बघू तर तिथे कोणत्या कम्युनल मेजॉरिटीला अपील आपल्याला दिसतंय. म्हणजे इज दॅट कम्युनल मेजॉरिटी एव्हर गोइंग टू चेंज? दे से इट इज द सेम 80% ऑफ द पॉप्युलेशन विच कंप्राइजेस द मेजॉरिटी अँड द कंट्री हॅज टू बी रन अकॉर्डिंग टू देअर डिक्टेट्स, है की नाही. तर इथे आपल्याला हे समजावं लागेल की वाय डज आंबेडकर थिंक द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन ॲज बिंग इन अ वे वल्नरेबल to the attacks that the communal majority might do to its own principles. I think Ambedkar's post 1950 speeches are very important in this regard. There he points out that there are not limitations of, when we say limitations of constitutionalism, we should not forget that Ambedkar also outlined the possibilities that a constitution can offer, right? And he judges the limitations of the constitution only according to whether they can fulfill these possibilities or not. तर इथे आपल्याला सतत हेच म्हणजे लक्षात घ्यावं लागेल की कोणत्या प्रकारचं पॉलिटिकल पॉवर किंवा कोणत्या प्रकारचं पॉलिटिकल ऑर्गनायझेशन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनचे जे सिद्धांत आहेत त्याला सोशल प्रॅक्टिसमध्ये आणू शकतात. आणखी इथे डॉक्टर आंबेडकरांचं ठाम मत आहे की हे कम्युनल मेजॉरिटी तर नाही आणू शकत. आणखी जेही पॉलिटिक्स कम्युनल मेजॉरिटीच्या आधारे चालते ते पॉलिटिक्स कॉन्स्टिट्युशनल पॉलिटिक्स नाही असू शकत. तर आय थिंक हे मुद्दा मी असा 1950s मध्ये संपला होता असा नाही मानत. आय थिंक दॅट इश्यू इज व्हेरी मच पर्टिनंट इवन इन आवर टाइम.
Sir,
Anyone else? Gunaratna Sontakke sir has actually texted, true, maintaining exclusivity by one group is one of the major reasons of caste formation in India, and this was discussed in Ambedkar's one of the papers that he has written in the chat box. Is there, I think, again there is one. Oh no, that's it. तुम्ही स्वतः निश्चयकडे जाताय तर हे तुमचं मेटाफिशिक दिशेने भटकणं नाही. अंकित तुझ्या सगळ्या आत्ताच्या बोलण्यामध्ये वी वर एक्सपेक्टिंग दॅट यू विल स्पीक अबाउट समथिंग अबाउट निश्चय.
आय हॅड इनिशियली म्हणजे मी असं प्लॅन केलं होतं की मी निश्चय आणि आंबेडकरवर बोलेन म्हणून, पण ते माझं जे चॅप्टर होतं ते थोडं मोठा होता. ते म्हणजे चॅप्टर कसा खूप मोठा झाला होता. तर आय वॉज स्ट्रगलिंग विथ कंप्रेसिंग इट विद इन अ 30 minute टाइम फ्रेम. तर माझ्याकडे जे म्हणजे थोडंसं शॉर्ट असा व्हर्जन होता चॅप्टरचा ते मी असं मला वाटलं की हे थोडं प्रेझेंट करता येईल बरोबर. तर दॅट इज अ व्हेरी दॅट इज अन इम्पॉर्टंट क्वेश्चन की निश्चयकडे काय जायचं मग. आणि याचं खूपच सिम्पल उत्तर आहे की आंबेडकर हिमसेल्फ वेंट अँड रेड Nietzsche. Ambedkar was a very well-traveled person. He had spent 3-4 months at Germany as well at the University of Bonn, and I think that is where he must have picked some Nietzsche from. His teacher John Dewey also was aware of Nietzsche's works from the 19th century. आणखी फक्त नीचे असा एक फिलॉसॉफर नाही आहे जे म्हणजे आंबेडकरांच्या पुस्तकांमध्ये आपल्याला सापडतो. There are several other philosophers. There are John Dewey. There is Ralph Waldo Emerson. There is There is this French philosopher called Henri Bergson. There is Friedrich Nietzsche, of course. there is Plato, there is Aristotle. So all of these figures are very much present in Ambedkar's works. So my research was very much involved with reading Ambedkar's works carefully and seeing what were the references to Nietzsche in Ambedkar's works and how can that be connected with Ambedkar's criticism of the Manusmriti, because नीचे बद्दल जेवढं डिस्कशन झालं आहे आंबेडकरांच्या पुस्तकांमध्ये, फॉर इन्स्टन्स इन फिलॉसॉफी ऑफ हिंदुइझम हे कलेक्टेड वर्क्सचा व्हॉल्यूम 3 मध्ये आहे, तर तिथे आपल्याला बघता येईल की डॉक्टर आंबेडकर इज मेनली क्रिटिसाइजिंग नीचेज रीडिंग ऑफ द मनुस्मृती. सो इट इज नॉट अ डिफ्लेक्शन इन माय ओपिनियन, इट इज trying to outline something that has not been discussed in Ambedkar scholarship so far, ki what exactly was Ambedkar's reading of Nietzsche and how does that relate to Ambedkar's criticism of the Manusmriti. These two questions I think were not discussed in contemporary scholarship, because of which मला वाटलं की याच्यावर काम केलं जाऊ शकते. So yeah.
But do you really think that if we are interpreting in metaphysical way, so metaphysical interpretation of Dr. Ambedkar, do you think that are we deflecting from Ambedkar's original thought or like that? Because I mean, Zamir's concern is that why are you going to Nietzsche? That is different point. Because you said categorically that many of scholars at university level, they talk about Ambedkar on metaphysical plane, and that is deflection. That's what you said. So I mean, discussing or interpreting in metaphysical way, are we indulging in a or are we creating new binary that if you're talking about Ambedkar on metaphysical plane, then that is not true Ambedkar? Okay. Do you think like that?
Yeah, I should clarify here what I meant by metaphysical, because I do not want to make this term into a term of abuse. म्हणजे असं शिवी सारखं मला नाही यूज करायचं मेटाफिजिक्स ना, दिस इज अ टेंडन्सी. Yeah, so there is, I would make a difference between metaphysics as a concern for thinking, which can be seen, for instance, I have also written one short paper which was presented at a conference about Ambedkar's view of nihilism as it can be discerned in the Buddha and his Dhamma. So Ambedkar discusses the theme of nihilism, Shunyavad, from the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna to its contemporary times via original Buddhist sources in the Buddha and his Dhamma. So Shunyavad as a doctrine or as an idea is highly metaphysical, in that it talks about the entire plane of beings and non-beings. And what are beings, what are non-beings, what are the differences between them ontologically. This is a very complicated discussion that Ambedkar indulges in the Buddha and his Dhamma. And that is something that I have also thought about and written about. So yes, it is crucial to see Ambedkar's own thinking about metaphysics in relation to the questions that he himself pursues. But when I said he is taken on a metaphysical level, the word metaphysical should not have been used there, but what I meant was that Ambedkar is taken away from his context. So what do I mean by context here? Context would be to see what are Ambedkar's social and political philosophical concerns, and whether Ambedkar can be taken in a place where these social considerations do not apply. I don't want to name scholars here, but I do see a certain tendency amongst certain scholars residing in abroad universities, where I think they take the social and political content of Ambedkar's philosophy and inject it with something which is not really related to, or which is at least not relevant to the project of annihilation of caste in India. But I do not want to say too much about this. Otherwise, controversy ho jayega.
Khatuman has asked. Hello.
Hello.
Who is speaking?
Aditya, sir.
Yes, Aditya. Do you have
So
it?
I had one question. So if we say, like, we do not take Ambedkar at that metaphysical level, and I really get what you are trying to say over here in this context. But if we actually say this, the people who are inclined towards the religious metaphysical aspect of Hinduism, they have this point that when Ambedkar says that Vedas are a set of not that much of a use. He calls them a useless book, basically.
Worthless
So,
books.
worthless books. Yeah. One and the same. So yeah. So when we say this, then they have a right to take it at that level. Don't you feel, sir? Because then you are shunning their entire belief system and trashing it at once. So then somewhere they have a right to do that and defend it, isn't it, sir?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the texts that Dr. Ambedkar discusses in throughout his writings have been defended, are still being defended to this day. So nobody has, and there is a large publishing industry attached to that. You see, like the Lok Sabha TV itself is advertising a book which tries to refute Dr. Ambedkar's reading of the Manusmriti, which is fair and fine. I mean, these are intellectual discussions. People have a right to disagree and so on and so forth. But one has to see from where is this cultural assertion really coming from, which is forming around the Manusmriti and forming around the Vedas and so on and so forth. So I think, and I think here two books are really important. I would recommend all of you to read it. Narhan Kurunkar's Marathi book, which is simply titled Manusmriti, and Pradeep Gokhale's, who we should know taught at Pune University itself, titled Vishamateza Puraskarta Manu. So these two books were written in the 1970s and 1980s, I think. And both of these books actually showcase the parts from the Manusmriti which are actually praised by upper castes for being liberal, quote unquote, and should be acceptable, as also being problematic in many respects, and how the Manusmriti should also be read in its context and so on and so forth. So I am not denying that discussions are not or that discussions are not taking place around these issues. I'm only concerned about what intellectual protocols are we following, and in terms of discussing these texts. If there is merit to certain aspects, then sure. I mean, we should have no problem in accepting certain parts of certain texts.
Thank you, sir.
Khatu ma'am, can you speak? Because she has actually texted here. Ma'am? Khatu ma'am? Ankit, she wrote there, it would be nice to hear the details from you about the theme, about your theme of Nietzsche and Ambedkar.
Okay,
I think that
okay.
even, I think that even as the problems of the vast majority of the scheduled caste and tribes are still very much serious and still hover around survival and essential issues, it doesn't mean that we don't study Dr. Ambedkar as a philosopher of the just egalitarian society. Would you find this relevant as well as pertinent? Okay.
Yeah, again, this is a very important question, because I see that I am, I guess, not able to convey my thoughts exactly on this point. So let me again clarify that when we say that, okay, taking Ambedkar out of his context of the very urgent social and political issues of our time is a bit unfair and so on. This does not imply that, or at least I do not think that it implies that we only read about, policy issues in Ambedkar. For instance, there is very, absolutely important work done by scholars like Sukhdev Thorat on Ambedkar's water policy, for example. Ambedkar was also the labor minister in the Viceroy's Council starting from 1942, and he had immense contribution to forming the water policy of independent India. Sukhdev Thorat has also studied Ambedkar's contribution to the Reserve Bank of India and India's monetary policy post-independence India. So when I say Ambedkar should not be read out of, like, this is as contextual Ambedkar as you can get. These are like he had written about policy issues during his lifetime. So we are studying that. So I think what we are in a way doing here, as Ashwati has pointed out, irrigation facility as well. Yes, that connects to the water policy contribution of Dr. Ambedkar. So I think what we are doing is in a way going slightly away or doing slightly different work from the policy domain, and thinking about what ideas did Ambedkar think about, and what were the philosophers and thinkers of his own time with whom he had disagreements with, agreements with, and so on and so forth. And I think that is part and parcel of studying Ambedkar as a philosopher. So yeah, I by no means do I suggest that Dr. Ambedkar's thinking should be only limited to studying the problems of the SCs and STs in contemporary India. Like, that would be a very vulgar thing for me to say. Again, let me give you an example. When we consider Ambedkar's whole engagement with Buddhism, I feel we should not remain merely limited to the Buddha and his Dhamma. For instance, I had an occasion to look at some of Ambedkar's sketches, for example. Ambedkar also wanted to learn painting during his lifetime, and towards the end of his life, he also sketched a few portraits. And there is one portrait that Dr. Ambedkar painted of the Buddha, which is, I think, unprecedented in the history of visual art in the Indian subcontinent, where Dr. Ambedkar painted the Buddha with open eyes. So Buddha is not shown usually with open eyes. Buddha is almost always shown in paintings and sculptures with closed eyes, with his head bowed down and sitting. And Ambedkar actually painted a portrait of the Buddha where Buddha is standing with his eyes open and looking, with his chin up. So these can give you very, very important and interesting ideas about what Ambedkar considered beauty, what Ambedkar considered as art. And I do not mean to say that, okay, if we take that we should not study these aspects of Dr. Ambedkar. And if we study these aspects of Dr. Ambedkar, or if we study Dr. Ambedkar's views on art, we would be deflecting away from the existential.
Yeah, I think you got muted.
Ankit.
Okay, sorry.
Actually, there was some, noise, so I actually.
Okay. No problem. Actually, there is a azan going on in my area right now, so I guess that must be. But are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I was just saying that if we study Ambedkar's, so I just wanted to ask, where did you lose me? Like, where was I exactly?
The very last line.
The very last line. Okay, yeah. So I'm just saying that. So I'm just saying that if we study Ambedkar's ideas of art or visual or visual art, for that matter, I do not think we are deflecting Ambedkar away from the existential concerns of the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes in contemporary India. That would be again unfair to the whole personality of Dr. Ambedkar, who could do all these different sorts of things, devising India's water policy on the one hand, to writing this masterpiece called the Buddha and his Dhamma, to painting a very simple pencil sketch of the Buddha with open eyes, which is, I think, unprecedented in the history of Buddhist art in the subcontinent. So yeah, I hope I have made my point clear here.
Ankit, you were referring to this D. Nagara's interpretation about Gandhi and Ambedkar.
Yeah.
And right now, I mean, in contemporary times, we are observing that there is a big project of exploration of convergence point of Gandhi and Ambedkar. On one hand, I mean, you must have read about, Suman sir has written about it.
Yes.
Even Ramsad Kasbe has written about it. And again, there is, it was reputed by Arundhati Roy, a doctor and son. So how do you look at this project of exploration of convergence point of Gandhi and Ambedkar?
Yeah, I think D.R. Nagaraj's book is very novel, at least I can say, because I do not think any other author has been as successful as D.R. Nagaraj in really trying to combine or think together with Gandhi and Ambedkar on questions that concerned them. And I am with D.R. Nagaraj on the point that religion was extremely important for both Gandhi and Ambedkar. All right, so I am with him till this point. But so far as I have gotten D.R. Nagaraj correct, he says that there was a case of mutual borrowing between Gandhi and Ambedkar on certain questions. So he says Gandhi learned from Ambedkar the importance of untouchability and the importance of doing away with caste entirely. So he very nicely charts out how before the 1930s, Gandhi did not pay enough attention to the problem of caste and untouchability. But it is only after his meeting with, I'm audible, right? Okay. But it is only after his meeting with Dr. Ambedkar that he began taking caste and untouchability seriously. Similarly, he points out that Ambedkar did not take religion very, very seriously till the 1930s, and he began taking religion very seriously, or the question of spirituality very seriously, only after he encountered Gandhi. I do not think I am really with D.R. Nagaraj on this second aspect, because it can be said that Ambedkar's engagement with the question of religion does reach, I think, its peak during the 1940s, which is a very important decade when he writes basically post 1936, post annihilation of caste period of his life, where he wrote texts like Philosophy of Hinduism, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Ancient India, Buddha or Karl Marx, Buddha and his Dhamma, and so on and so forth. Yes, I do see that religion figures immensely in the post 1936 period, but I do not think that it is only due to Gandhi's influence that Ambedkar began taking religion very, very seriously. I think religion is very much a center point of Ambedkar's thinking right from his early thinking from the 1916 time when he wrote Castes in India, their mechanism, genesis, and development. And upon the question, so I think this is my view at this point. And again, with the question of conversion, it's very, very important that you asked, because it needs to be clarified again and again. That D.R. Nagaraj makes a confusion between the question of conversion and the question of converting to Buddhism. Because although Gandhi was open to the question of conversion, but he was very much against untouchables converting to any other religion apart from Hinduism, because he firmly believed that untouchables were a crucial part of Hindu society, and he believed that they are only a split off from the 4 varnas, and they were only originally 4 varnas, and there should not have been a 5th varna, and so on and so forth. So he was very much against the idea of untouchables converting to any other religion apart from Hinduism, although he was open to conversion as an individual practice. Like, I as an individual can think about the Gita, I can think about the Quran, I can think about the Bible and this and that. But as a social question, as a social group converting to any other religion, Gandhi in his works was not approving of it. So this is again, I think, a misconstrual on the part of D.R. Nagaraj, where he confuses the question of which exact group is converting to which exact religion, as opposed to Gandhi's openness to the question of conversion as such, and saying that, okay, there is a mutual borrowing from Ambedkar and Gandhi on the question of conversion. So yeah, that is something that I wanted to say. I have not read Kasbe's work, but I have read Professor Suman's work, and I do find it very challenging, to say the least, because I think, again, like, if his works are translated into English, they will, I think, really be at par with D.R. Nagaraj in trying to combine Dr. Ambedkar and Gandhi's philosophy for our time. One difference I would like to mention between Professor Suman's work and D.R. Nagaraj's work is that Professor Sumant very nicely, and I think very importantly, focuses on contemporary issues as well. So I remember reading one chapter on, again, this, I think there was a question asked about the whole city village thing as well, and how caste persists in the urban areas. So yeah, Professor Sumant says that leave aside their disagreements that they had in their real life. But do we not see a necessity of combining the philosophy and politics of both Gandhi and Ambedkar when we look at certain crises of our time? So Professor Suman's work is very much, a project written for our time, where he says that Gandhi and Ambedkar both are needed. So for instance, when he talks about Indian villages being, having no educational institutions of higher education, he's saying that here we need to combine both Gandhi and Ambedkar. He gives a very practical example. Since Gandhi gave so much impetus to village life, yes, that should be retained. Along with that, Ambedkar's impetus on higher education, because Gandhi's Nai Talim had very ambiguous position on whether technical education that is received in the higher echelons are to be taken or not. But Professor Suman does not share that view so far as I have read. So I think, it is in these aspects that I think Professor Suman's work is different from D.R. Nagaraj and is also superior in certain extent.
Arundhati Roy.
Arundhati Roy is...
Yeah, and again, this is the same question Pratik Thakre is asking in the chat box. Is there really any point where thoughts of Ambedkar and Gandhi converge? I mean, the same topic on the same line. Yeah. So Arundhati Roy, yeah.
Yeah, that is an important question. I think, see, there are different ways of reading two or three thinkers together. For instance, if you were to ask me, is there really any point where the thoughts of Ambedkar and Gandhi converge? I can list out several things upon which their thoughts converge. I can list the primacy of independence for India as a very basic point upon which their thought converges. I can list out again the primacy of religion for public life. Again, here D.R. Nagaraj is very right that Ambedkar and Gandhi stand on one end, and Nehru and Savarkar to an extent, because both were atheists. That is very important. Savarkar and Nehru belong in one plane, and Ambedkar and Gandhi belong in one plane when it comes to the question of religion. And again, he's right on that. So yeah, I can list out many such things where their thoughts converge. But I think as scholars, what we need to do is, to also look deep into the notion of difference, because I can find out a similarity between Gandhi and Ambedkar on this question and end my research there, but what would be more interesting is to see, okay, are there any fine differences between these two thinkers on a particular question on which there is a broad agreement? Like, there is a broad agreement that India should be free from British rule, but are there fine-tuned differences between their thought about what are the actions, what are the ways in which independence should be achieved, what should be the structure of the political class after independence? I mean, there are several such questions that can be, asked of 2-3 thinkers when they're read together. And I would just say that it is the differences, the intellectual differences between 2 or 3 or 4 thinkers that actually makes studying them interesting. Otherwise, 2 thinkers which agree with almost everything on every question, it's not very interesting to read them, is it? Yeah.
Anyway. Is there any other question? Okay, and I think let's stop here. Thank you very much, Ankit. It was really thought-provoking, and actually we could discuss many issues in question answer session. प्रश्नोत्तराच्या याच्यामध्ये आणखीन काही मुद्दे आल्यामुळे मला वाटतं की चांगलं मंथन झालं. Thank you again.
Yeah, it was my absolute pleasure. I just want to end by saying that this was really special because I hope, I don't know if people know or not, but I did my graduation from Ferguson College in Pune, and visiting the university was always very was a happy moment because of the greenery of the university mainly. So I am really happy that I got to encounter my former teacher, Aarti ma'am here, and Kalpana ma'am is also here. I can see ma'am's name. So yeah, it was a really touching experience that I got to interact with them, and Avate sir also, I think after 5 or 6 years almost, that I got to interact with all of you after such a long
Earlier,
time.
you discussed your first EPW paper
Yes,
in my FY class,
yes,
and
yes.
it was a very interesting session.
Yeah.
Even we could discuss your another paper, that impossibility of Dalit studies.
Yeah,
I think that's
yeah,
also interesting topic, but
sure.
we can discuss it.
Later, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, again, thank you so much for having me, and thank you especially to the Department of Political Science at SPPU for hosting a mere MPhil student. Yeah, here. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Ankit. Yeah. Yes.